They had been told stories that turned surrender into a fate worse than death. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific believed capture by the Americans meant starvation, torture, or humiliation, so deep that it erased honor forever. Their own commanders had reinforced this view. Surrender was shame, captivity was disgrace, and the enemy would show no mercy. For months, they fought in jungles and islands where malaria spread faster than food supplies, where rations dwindled to scraps of rice, and where each man carried not only a rifle, but the crushing certainty that capture equaled annihilation. Yet when defeat became unavoidable, many discovered that the moment of surrender did not end with execution, but with a strange and confusing journey across the Pacific. The transport ships that carried them away were themselves symbols of contradiction. Packed into the holds like cargo, Japanese prisoners expected little more than a slow death by disease or neglect. They braced for cruelty, for beatings, for taunts, and a language they could barely understand. But when the vessels neared the continental United States, another fear grew, fear of the unknown. Few had ever imagined stepping foot on enemy soil. To them, America was an abstract place, a land of factories, endless steel, and soldiers who fought with terrifying firepower. Now, disarmed and stripped of authority, they were about to meet the enemy face to face. The first steps onto American soil shattered expectations. Guards stood in formation with rifles slung at their shoulders, eyes watchful, movements brisk. Yet the atmosphere lacked the wild brutality the prisoners had imagined. Instead, there was procedure, marching lines, rolls called, names recorded in neat handwriting on forms. Each man was logged not as a nameless captive, but as a number in a system. This orderly processing stunned the prisoners. They had been told to expect rage from their enemies. Instead, they were confronted with something far colder: bureaucracy. The contradiction deepened when rations were issued. Bread with butter, coffee poured into tin cups. Meat, sometimes beef, sometimes pork, steaming on plates. Many prisoners had not seen such food in months, if not years. To men who had scraped mold from rice or eaten roots to survive, the simple act of being handed warm bread was almost incomprehensible. They had imagined starvation, yet here was nourishment. Suspicion clouded every bite. Was the food poisoned? Was this kindness a trap? But hunger gnawed too deeply to resist, and gradually the men ate, bewildered by the notion that their enemies could feed them rather than starve them. Behind this routine lay a larger strategy. American officials adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, not simply from moral conviction, but from calculated reasoning. A well-treated prisoner was less likely to rebel, less likely to create unrest. Moreover, the presence of international inspectors from organizations like the Red Cross meant that every meal, every bunk, every medical check could become a report circulated to allies and enemies alike. By maintaining order and decency, America projected an image of strength, not only on the battlefield, but in how it handled its captives. The camps themselves reinforced this lesson. From a distance, they looked like fortified compounds, tall fences, rolls of barbed wire, watchtowers with guards scanning the horizon. Yet inside, the layout was strikingly different from the brutal prisons the Japanese imagined. Rows of wooden barracks lined up like military housing, kitchens, infirmaries, recreation grounds, even libraries stocked with English books, for men who had spent years in mud-filled foxholes, where letters from home never arrived and sickness spread unchecked. The sudden existence of such facilities felt surreal, almost dreamlike. Still, the shock of order could not erase the physical toll of war. Many prisoners arrived emaciated, their bodies ravaged by malaria, dysentery, or festering wounds. They braced themselves when medical staff approached, expecting neglect or perhaps experiments. Instead, American doctors and medics examined them with methodical efficiency. Thermometers recorded fevers. Bandages covered open sores. Parasites were logged, treatments administered. The prisoners did not know how to interpret this. Some resisted, convinced it was a ploy. Others stared in silence, stunned that their survival mattered at all to the enemy. What unsettled them most was not cruelty, but the mechanical kindness, clinical, detached, and dictated by rules rather than emotion. This early exposure to American systems left lasting impressions. Japanese soldiers were trained in improvisation, in making do with scarcity, in enduring without complaint. Their garrisons often resembled desperate survival camps, with soldiers sewing their own torn uniforms, cutting one another's hair with dull blades, and drinking from the same muddy streams that spread disease. In America, everything appeared inverted. Clean water was plentiful. Soap lingered in the air. Schedules structured every activity. Where Japanese military culture praised stoicism and filth, the Americans insisted that order grew from cleanliness, from routines enforced not by suffering, but by regulation. Another shock came in the leveling of social hierarchy. In Japan, officers commanded absolute deference. Rank determined not only authority but social identity, ingrained from childhood through strict codes of respect. In the American camps, however, officers and enlisted men alike were processed side by side. Prisoners discovered that the enemy did not place elaborate emphasis on rank when it came to captivity. Efficiency outweighed ceremony. This subtle flattening of status unsettled Japanese officers most of all. To stand shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers during inspections was a quiet humiliation, a reminder that America valued procedure over hierarchy. Rumors spread quickly in these first weeks. Whispers filled the barracks at night. Some said barbers would arrive to cut their hair. Others claimed that uniforms would be issued, clean clothes bearing markings that branded them as captives. Still others whispered of laundry collection, of clothes taken away and returned as if they lived in a civilian town. At first these stories sounded absurd, the fantasies of men trying to distract themselves from despair. Yet soon each rumor proved real. The Americans operated on systems the prisoners could neither predict nor understand, and each revelation added to the growing sense of disorientation. For soldiers who had equated capture with degradation, the arrival experience carried an irony that gnawed at them in silence. Instead of whips and starvation, they faced a different kind of discipline, one enforced through schedules, paperwork, and routines. It was not the brutality of chaos, but the order of rules. In a strange way, this made captivity even more bewildering. To be reduced to numbers, to be marched in lines, to be inspected and catalogued, this was not the dishonor they had feared, but it stripped them of identity in a far subtler way. The Americans did not need to beat them into submission. They folded them into a system where individuality dissolved into procedure. In diaries written long after the war, former prisoners often described this first stage of captivity with the same word, surreal. They had stepped from jungle battlefields drenched in sweat and disease into an environment where soap, food, and medical care were abundant. They had prepared for cruelty, yet encountered bureaucracy. They had expected starvation, yet were handed rations. And above all, they had believed that surrender meant erasure, only to discover that captivity meant something far stranger, the transformation of war's chaos into a rhythm of order. This was only the beginning. What awaited them inside the camps would challenge not just their bodies, but their deepest cultural assumptions. Cleanliness, grooming, and the routines of daily life would soon become tools of discipline as powerful as any weapon. For men raised to believe endurance in filth was proof of strength, the discovery that the enemy saw dignity in cleanliness would be the most profound shock of all. For the first few days inside the American camps, the Japanese prisoners moved cautiously, waiting for the cruelty they had been told would come. They whispered that perhaps the food was a trick, that the medicine was a preparation for some harsher punishment. Yet the next shock did not come in the form of a blow or a rifle butt. It came in the form of soap, water, and a command: shower time. To the Americans, this was routine. Cleanliness was regulation, as important as guard duty or inspection. But to the Japanese prisoners, it was utterly foreign. On the battlefronts of the Pacific, soldiers had endured months without proper washing. Sweat caked with dust, mud clung to uniforms, lice burrowed into seams of clothing. A bath was often a brief dunk in a polluted stream, if one existed. The idea of a regular enforced shower seemed not just unnecessary, but alien. When the guards ordered them to strip and move toward the shower blocks, suspicion spread like fire through the ranks. The word shower carried dark echoes. Many whispered about stories from Europe, of German camps, of showers that released not water, but poison gas. Though the Japanese did not know the full truth of those stories, the fear of deception was instinctive. Why would the enemy insist on such a thing? What purpose could this serve except humiliation or worse? The first gush of hot water struck like revelation. Steam filled the air, soap slid across skin, and the stench of weeks, sometimes months, of unwashed bodies began to lift. For many, it was the first hot shower of their lives. Japanese bathing culture before the war revolved around communal hot springs or tubs in villages, luxuries stripped away by the brutal logistics of military campaigns. In the field, soldiers accepted grime as proof of endurance. Now, for the first time in years, they felt heat soaking into their pores, dirt dissolving into drains. Some wept silently, ashamed of the relief that washed over them. The Americans did not intend this as kindness. For them, hygiene was discipline. A clean prisoner was a healthier prisoner, less likely to spread disease, less likely to become a burden on camp hospitals. But it was also psychological. Order grew from routine, and nothing enforced routine more sharply than the demand to wash, to cut hair, to shave. Dirt represented chaos, and chaos invited rebellion. Cleanliness was control disguised as decency. After showers came the barbers. At first, the prisoners resisted. Hair carried cultural meaning. To shave it off felt like stripping away dignity. But the barbers worked with brisk efficiency, clippers buzzing, scissors snipping, hair falling into piles. Uniformity was the goal. The wild, matted hair of men pulled from the jungle gave way to regulation cuts, neat and precise. Each head became another identical silhouette, another cog in the machinery of the camp. The transformation was unsettling. Where once individuality had clung stubbornly even in captivity, the barbers erased it in minutes. Beards and stubble met the same fate. Guards insisted on shaving, issuing razors and sometimes guiding the process for those who had never handled such tools. In Japanese culture, the beard carried little status, but the American insistence on smooth, clean-shaven faces struck the prisoners as oddly obsessive. To the guards, a shaved face meant discipline and respect for order. To the prisoners, it was yet another reminder that even their bodies no longer belonged to them. They belonged to the rules of the camp. The shock went beyond hygiene. It was the ritual of it. Every morning, lines formed outside wash stations. Water splashed in rhythm. Razors scraped in unison. Haircuts were scheduled. Showers rotated through blocks of men at fixed intervals. This strict choreography left no room for argument. The camp itself pulsed to the beat of routines, each man absorbed into a collective rhythm that erased the chaos of battlefields and replaced it with a regulated calm. Some prisoners resisted in small ways. A few tried to avoid the showers, feigning sickness or dragging their feet. Others let their hair grow as long as possible before being forced back into the barber's chair. But resistance proved useless. The Americans did not shout or strike. They simply enforced. The guards' authority lay not in cruelty, but in unyielding routine. It was discipline through inevitability. Psychologically, this struck deep. Japanese soldiers had been raised to see suffering as proof of strength. To endure dirt, lice, and hunger without complaint was considered honorable. Now the enemy demanded the opposite. To be considered disciplined, they must be clean, shaved, orderly. This inversion of values gnawed at their sense of identity. Was it weakness to enjoy the hot water on aching muscles? Was it dishonor to welcome the relief of a clean shirt? The contradiction left them silent, torn between pride and instinct. One prisoner later recalled in his diary that he feared the shower more than battle. Not because of pain, but because it stripped away the image he had built of himself as a soldier. "We were made to feel like children," he wrote, lined up, scrubbed, and trimmed until no dirt remained. We were no longer warriors, only men managed by others. Yet beneath the discomfort lay undeniable transformation. Health improved. Skin diseases receded. Lice infestations disappeared. Cuts healed faster when cleaned. Even the prisoners could not deny that the routines worked. Gradually, the shock gave way to a reluctant acceptance. Some even began to look forward to showers, though they rarely admitted it aloud. The first plunge of warm water against cold mornings became a private relief, a reminder that survival, however strange, was still possible. But the Americans knew the deeper power of these routines. Cleanliness was not just about hygiene. It was about control over time. By dictating when a man shaved, when he washed, when his hair was cut, the camp dictated his entire rhythm of existence. A prisoner who lived by the enemy's clock was a prisoner who had surrendered more than his weapon. He had surrendered his autonomy. In this way, soap and water became tools as effective as rifles. Where bullets had forced surrender in battle, showers enforced surrender in captivity. A man might still cling to pride in silence, but his body betrayed him each morning when he lined up to be washed, shaved, and inspected. The very act of compliance reshaped his identity. The Japanese POWs entered the camps believing they would resist the enemy to the last breath. Instead, they found themselves resisting a far subtler force, the erosion of self through routines. Cleanliness, once seen as luxury or weakness, became a daily ritual enforced with unshakable regularity. And as days turned to weeks, the prisoners realized the war they now fought was not against hunger or bullets, but against the quiet power of order itself. This was the true shock of hygiene in captivity, that survival required not endurance of filth, but submission to cleanliness. It was a paradox few had ever imagined, and it reshaped not only their bodies, but their understanding of discipline itself. If the showers and barbers stripped the Japanese prisoners of their old identities, the next step was to clothe them in new ones. The moment came quietly, without ceremony, yet it carried immense weight. The issuing of camp uniforms. The Japanese soldiers had marched into captivity in tattered remnants of field gear. Jungle rot had eaten through canvas. Buttons were missing, seams ripped, sleeves ragged. Many wore sandals cut from scraps of rubber, others marched barefoot. Their uniforms were no longer symbols of an army. They were the scars of defeat stitched into fabric. Now, those rags were taken away, bundled into piles, marked for disposal, or sometimes burned to prevent lice and disease. In their place came fresh sets of clothing, simple cotton trousers, shirts, jackets, often marked with bold letters, PW or POW. Each garment erased individuality and replaced it with the single identity of captivity. At first, the act of surrendering their old uniforms cut deeply. Those clothes, however ragged, were the last links to their status as imperial soldiers. To lose them felt like losing the final thread of honor. Many resisted quietly, hiding small pieces of insignia, a button, a strip of cloth torn from a sleeve. These fragments became secret talismans, reminders of who they had once been. But the camp uniforms could not be avoided. To move without them was to invite punishment. To wear them was to vanish into the mass of prisoners. Laundry routines deepened this transformation. The Americans insisted on a cycle: dirty clothes collected, laundered, returned folded and clean. To the Japanese, this system was bewildering. In the field, washing clothes was a rare luxury. Often soldiers rinsed garments in rivers or not at all, wearing the same uniforms until they rotted from the body. Clean clothing was not a priority. Endurance in filth was proof of strength. Now the enemy demanded the opposite. At first, prisoners suspected a trick. Why would guards take their clothes? Would they be returned? Would they be forced to stand half-naked while their garments were destroyed? Fear spread quickly through the barracks when laundry details first arrived. Yet the system proved real. Clothes came back, washed, pressed, sometimes even repaired. The precision of it shocked them. Each shirt labeled, each set returned to the same man who had surrendered it. The Americans operated not out of kindness, but out of a machine-like order. This ritual carried deep psychological weight. The Japanese prisoners were being taught, slowly and relentlessly, that their survival depended on the systems of the enemy. To wear clean clothes, they had to trust the camp's processes. To keep lice away, they had to surrender garments to strangers. Each cycle of laundry reinforced dependence, stripping away autonomy thread by thread. The symbolism of uniforms reached beyond cleanliness. For the Americans, the bold PW marking served practical purposes: identification, prevention of escape, control in crowds. But for the prisoners, those letters branded them with shame. They were no longer soldiers of the emperor. They were property of the camp. Even their clothing announced captivity. To step outside without that mark was impossible. To see it reflected in every other man around them was to be reminded, constantly, that they were no longer individuals, but a category. The transformation was not only external. Clean clothing altered behavior. With lice gone, skin no longer crawling with infection, the prisoners stood straighter, breathed easier. Yet this physical relief came at a cost. They knew the change came not from their own discipline, but from the enemy's systems. It was a bitter paradox, feeling healthier while knowing that health was controlled by those who had defeated them. Within the barracks, the uniforms created new dynamics. Hierarchy blurred further. In the Japanese army, distinctions of rank were reinforced by uniform details: sashes, badges, officer tunics. In the camps, these vanished. Officers and enlisted men wore the same plain garments, marked only by the camp's symbols. To the Americans, this was efficient. To the Japanese, it was humiliating. A general looked like a private, a sergeant like a recruit. Centuries of ingrained respect for rank collapsed under cotton shirts stamped with PW. Some tried to resist through small gestures, a neatly folded cuff, a carefully polished shoe, a hidden stitch of thread saved from their old uniforms, sewn secretly into the new. These acts carried no practical effect, but they became tiny rebellions, ways of preserving fragments of identity. Yet the overall effect could not be denied. The uniforms erased differences, turning warriors into prisoners, soldiers into numbers. The laundry cycle became one of the most strangely symbolic routines of captivity. Clothes went out stained and wrinkled, came back crisp and clean. In the process, the men themselves were transformed, not by choice, but by compulsion. Each cycle reminded them, the enemy controlled not just their food, not just their movement, but the very fabric on their backs. And yet, some prisoners began to experience a reluctant appreciation. Clean clothing reduced sickness. It eased the itching that had driven them mad in the jungle. It gave them a strange comfort at night when they lay down on cots instead of mud. For the first time in months, some could sleep without scratching. The contradiction grew sharper. The enemy gave them what their own army had denied: hygiene, health, rest. This unspoken truth gnawed at pride like rust on iron. The Americans, for their part, understood the psychological power of uniforms. A prisoner in clean clothes looked manageable, orderly, contained. The chaos of war seemed far away when lines of men in identical garments marched to mess halls or stood at roll call. Order could be seen, smelled, even felt in the air. This was discipline through fabric, and it was as effective as barbed wire. Over time, the uniforms became second skin. Men stopped noticing the letters stamped across their chests. They grew used to laundry schedules, to the smell of soap clinging to cotton. What had begun as humiliation turned into routine, and routine became normal. This normalization was perhaps the deepest transformation of all, for when captivity begins to feel normal, freedom feels more distant than ever. In quiet moments, some prisoners reflected on the irony. They had once believed that suffering in filth was a form of strength. Now they realized that their captors believed the opposite, that strength came from order, from cleanliness, from systems that left no room for decay. This clash of philosophies played out not on the battlefield, but in the laundries of prison camps. And slowly, inevitably, the prisoners absorbed the lesson, even as they hated it. The story of the uniforms and laundry was not about fabric alone. It was about the stripping and reshaping of identity. Where once their uniforms marked them as soldiers of the emperor, now they marked them as prisoners of America. The cloth on their backs told the story of their fall, and every wash, every fold, every stamped letter pressed that story deeper into their minds. And yet, beneath the shame and the routine, something else lingered. A strange awareness that survival had taken a new form. To live was to wear the enemy's clothes, to trust the enemy's systems, to endure the erasure of individuality. It was captivity woven into every thread, captivity laundered into cotton until it smelled not of sweat and dirt, but of order itself. By the time months had passed in the American camps, the Japanese prisoners of war no longer jumped at every new routine. Showers, haircuts, laundry collection, uniform exchanges, these no longer shocked them. What had begun as bewilderment gradually hardened into habit. Yet it was precisely in this transformation, from resistance to acceptance, that the deepest psychological battle was being fought. In the beginning, the men had carried themselves stiffly, clinging to fragments of dignity, whispering defiance in the barracks. They spoke of the emperor in hushed tones, of brothers still fighting in the Pacific. They convinced themselves captivity was temporary, that death would have been nobler, that they remained soldiers even without weapons. But the slow march of routines eroded that posture. Each time they stood in line for inspection, each time they handed over dirty clothes and received clean ones, each time they shaved their faces smooth, the idea of themselves as warriors faded a little more. The Americans did not need to break their bodies. They broke their rhythms. Identity, after all, is built on daily rituals. On the battlefield, Japanese soldiers had survived by improvisation, by eating whatever they found, wearing the same uniform until it fell apart, enduring filth as proof of spirit. In the camps, that identity was overwritten by new rituals. Regulated meals, scheduled showers, controlled clothing. Slowly, the rhythm of the enemy became the rhythm of their lives. This psychological reshaping was not accidental. American camp authorities understood that rebellion thrived in chaos. A man left to stew in filth and hunger was a man likely to lash out, to plot escape, to stir unrest. But a man whose day was broken into fixed intervals of cleanliness, meals, inspections, and rest was a man tamed by routine. The camp became a machine of order, not of cruelty. Its power lay not in violence, but in predictability. For the Japanese prisoners, this was a new kind of captivity. They had expected chains, whips, and starvation. Instead, they found themselves bound by schedules, by soap, by the demand to appear orderly. It was a subtler domination, one that sank into the mind rather than the flesh. A prisoner could tell. Himself, he remained loyal to Japan, but when he lined up for his weekly haircut or folded his laundered uniform, he was acting within the discipline of the enemy. Some resisted silently. In diaries smuggled through the camps, a few prisoners described dreams of escape, fantasies of tearing down fences and running into the wilderness. But those dreams often collapsed against reality. The uniforms, stamped boldly with PW, marked them as prisoners from a mile away. The guards did not need chains. Clothing itself became the chain. And so most men surrendered to the rhythm, even as they hated it. The erosion of individuality was perhaps the hardest blow. In Japanese culture, identity was deeply tied to group hierarchy. Officers commanded with authority. Enlisted men obeyed with respect. Even in defeat, soldiers carried pride in their rank. Yet the camp erased these distinctions. Everyone wore the same uniform. Everyone queued for the same showers. Everyone's name appeared as a number in ledgers. The collapse of hierarchy left many disoriented. Former officers, once obeyed without question, now stood powerless among common soldiers. This equalizing effect gnawed at their sense of self more than hunger ever could. But the greatest irony was that captivity improved their health. Malaria outbreaks dwindled. Lice disappeared. Skin infections healed. Weight returned to gaunt bodies. The very enemy they had sworn to fight had given them what their own army had denied: medical care, nutrition, rest. This contradiction haunted the prisoners. Could honor survive when survival itself was tied to the systems of the enemy? Could loyalty remain pure when the body felt relief at the routines imposed by captors? For some, this tension cracked their spirit. Quietly, they began to adapt, not just outwardly, but inwardly. They learned the patterns of the camp, anticipated schedules, even found comfort in predictability. They stopped whispering of resistance and instead whispered of the strange civility of the Americans. It was not affection, not admiration, but a reluctant acknowledgement. The enemy had conquered not only the battlefield, but the rhythms of daily life. Yet not all prisoners bent so easily. A stubborn core clung to defiance. They polished their boots obsessively, refusing to let the enemy define the standard of discipline. They taught each other martial songs at night, reminding themselves of who they had once been. They guarded fragments of their old uniforms as relics, stitched into camp clothing as secret badges of identity. These acts were small, often unnoticed, but to those who performed them, they were lifelines to honor. Still, the broader truth could not be denied. By the end of the war, the vast majority of Japanese POWs had been absorbed into the camp systems. They ate when told, washed when told, marched when told. Freedom of will had not been beaten out of them. It had been regimented out of them. Cleanliness had become captivity. When release finally came, another shock awaited. Many prisoners returned to Japan healthier than when they had been captured. Families expected to see broken men, shattered by torture and starvation. Instead, they saw men who, though thinner than before, carried clear skin, repaired clothing. Even stories of meals far richer than what civilians had endured under rationing. Some Japanese civilians, themselves gaunt from scarcity, listened with disbelief when former prisoners spoke of bread, butter, and hot showers. The shame was doubled. Not only had they surrendered, but in captivity, they had lived in some ways better than their countrymen. This created a strange silence after the war. Many former POWs spoke little of their experiences. To admit they had been well-fed, cared for, and regimented by the enemy was to admit a betrayal of the image of endurance. And so, the memories of showers, barbers, laundry, and uniforms were often buried, locked away as private contradictions. Historians today recognize the irony. The Japanese military preached honor through suffering, yet many of its soldiers survived only because the Americans forced them into cleanliness, order, and discipline of a different kind. Captivity reshaped them, not through cruelty, but through routine. It was a victory of systems over spirit, of regulation over improvisation. The legacy of those camps lingers in the quiet testimonies of survivors. Some remembered the humiliation, the erasure of rank, the shame of wearing PW. Others remembered the relief of soap against skin, the first clean shirt after months of filth, the hot water that felt like a miracle. Most remembered both, the bitterness and the relief, intertwined forever. The story of Japanese prisoners in American camps is not one of brutality or kindness alone. It is the story of identity transformed by routine. Where swords and rifles had once defined them, showers and uniforms came to shape their days. Their war ended not in chaos, but in order. And for many, the greatest shock of captivity was not defeat itself, but the strange, undeniable truth that survival had come wrapped in the discipline of cleanliness,